Let's start with the question no one really wants to ask out loud. Why do so many of the most creative people seem unstable? Why does brilliance so often come packaged with chaos? Why do we associate great art with breakdowns, addiction, depression, or madness? And maybe more uncomfortably, why do we secretly believe that if we become too stable, too peaceful, too normal, our creativity will dry up? This question sits quietly in the back of every writer's mind, every artist's, every musician, filmmaker, poet, thinker. Does extreme creativity require instability? Or is that just a story we keep telling ourselves? Let's talk about it, honestly. The romantic myth of the mad genius. We've all heard it. Van Gogh cutting off his ear, Sylvia Plath and the oven, Kurt Cobain and the needle, Virginia Woolf walking into the river, Nietzsche collapsing into silence. We're taught, implicitly, that greatness and suffering are intertwined, that creativity is fueled by pain, that madness sharpens perception, that the artist must burn. And over time, this turns into a dangerous belief. If I heal, I'll lose my edge. If I become stable, I'll become boring. If I stop hurting, I'll stop creating. But here's the first uncomfortable truth. We don't just observe this myth, we actively reward it. We praise tortured artists more than peaceful ones. We call suffering depth. We confuse emotional chaos with authenticity. And so the myth survives. But let's slow down. Because before we go any further, we need to separate three very different things: creativity, sensitivity, dysregulation. They often overlap, but they are not the same. Highly creative people are usually highly sensitive. They feel more, they notice more, they absorb more of the world, emotionally, psychologically, symbolically. But sensitivity does not automatically equal instability. What does cause instability is when that sensitivity has no container, no grounding, no structure, no nervous system regulation, no emotional literacy. That's when creativity becomes overwhelming instead of generative. Let's talk about Vincent van Gogh, not as a myth, but as a human being. Van Gogh was not crazy because he was creative. He was likely dealing with severe mental illness, possibly bipolar disorder, epilepsy, or psychosis, in a time when none of that was understood or treated. He lived in poverty, he was socially isolated, he drank heavily, he had no emotional support system. And yet, we look at his suffering and say, yes, that's where the art came from. But here's the real question no one asks. What art might he have created if he had been supported? If he had access to therapy, medication, community, stability, would he have painted less or more? We assume suffering was the fuel, but it may have been the fire that consumed him. Sylvia Plath and the Cost of Raw Exposure. Sylvia Plath wrote with terrifying honesty. She didn't soften emotions. She didn't intellectualize pain. She went straight into it, no filter, no armor. That kind of emotional openness is powerful. But it's also dangerous, especially without boundaries. Plath didn't just write about her inner world, she lived inside it. And when creativity becomes identity, when the artist cannot step out of the material, there's no refuge. The problem wasn't her creativity, it was that there was no distance between the observer and the experience, no psychological safety net. Creativity as a permeable boundary. Here's something most people don't talk about. Highly creative minds often have thin psychological boundaries. They don't just imagine emotions, they inhabit them. They don't just observe the world, they absorb it. This is why creativity feels ecstatic at times and unbearable at others, because the same openness that allows insight also allows overwhelm. Without grounding, the nervous system stays in a constant state of intensity, and intensity, over time, burns people out. But let's challenge the assumption, because here's where the story starts to break down. If creativity requires instability, then why do so many deeply creative people thrive after healing? Why do artists often produce their best work once they're sober, grounded, and emotionally integrated? Let's look at a few counterexamples. Leonard Cohen, depth without destruction. Leonard Cohen struggled deeply with depression, but noticed something important. As he aged, his work didn't become shallow, it became clearer, more distilled, more spacious. He once said, "I don't look for happiness, I look for clarity." Cohen learned how to contain his depth. He didn't numb it, he didn't glorify it, he worked with it slowly, deliberately. His later work wasn't born from chaos, it was born from integration. Haruki Murakami, discipline over drama. Haruki Murakami writes surreal, emotionally resonant fiction, but his life, almost aggressively stable. He wakes up early, writes for a set number of hours, runs every day, goes to bed early, no chaos, no tortured genius persona. And yet, his work explores loneliness, dream logic, existential dislocation. This challenges the myth completely. Murakami once said, "I need physical strength to handle the mental strength required for writing." In other words, stability isn't the enemy of creativity, it's what makes deep creativity sustainable. Creativity versus emotional dysregulation. Let's get something straight. Many people aren't afraid of losing creativity if they heal, they're afraid of losing intensity. But intensity is not the same as depth. Intensity is loud. Depth is spacious. Intensity is chaotic. Depth is precise. When you're dysregulated, emotions feel overwhelming. And that can feel like inspiration. But often, it's just raw nervous system activation. True creativity doesn't require emotional flooding. It requires presence. Why chaos feels productive, but isn't? There's a reason instability feels creative. When you're emotionally dysregulated, your thoughts race, associations jump rapidly, emotions feel amplified, meaning feels urgent. That can look like creativity. But here's the catch. You might generate ideas, but you often can't finish anything. Chaos creates sparks, stability builds fires. Most great work isn't born from a breakdown. It's born from returning to the material again and again. The nervous system behind creativity. Creativity doesn't come from madness. It comes from flexibility. A nervous system that can enter imagination, tolerate ambiguity, sit with uncertainty, move between intensity and rest. When someone is stuck in chronic instability, they lose that flexibility. They're either flooded or shut down. Neither state is sustainable for creation. Why we fear stability. Here's the deeper layer. Many creatives grew up in emotional chaos. Instability feels familiar. Stillness feels suspicious. So when healing starts to happen, the mind panics. If I calm down, who will I be? If I stop suffering, what will I write about? But this fear misunderstands something fundamental. Healing doesn't erase experience. It changes your relationship to it. You don't lose depth, you gain perspective. What happens when creativity is no longer a coping mechanism? For many people, creativity begins as survival, writing to process pain, art to regulate emotion, music to express what couldn't be spoken. And that's valid. But when creativity is the only regulation tool, when it replaces connection, rest, and support, it becomes fragile. Healing doesn't remove creativity. It removes the desperation behind it. And what's left is often more refined, more intentional, more powerful. So what's the real answer? Does extreme creativity come at the cost of stability or sanity? No, but uncontained sensitivity often does. Creativity doesn't require suffering, it requires access to emotion, imagination, and meaning. Suffering just happens to be one of the most intense access points, but it's not the only one. Here's a better way to look at it. Creativity thrives on openness. Stability provides the container. Integration turns experience into art. Without a container, openness becomes overwhelming. Without openness, stability becomes sterile. The magic is in the balance. Some of the most powerful creative work doesn't come from people who are falling apart. It comes from people who've been there and learned how to come back, who can enter the depths without drowning, who can feel intensely without being consumed, who can create not to survive, but to express. That's not madness, that's mastery. And maybe the real question isn't whether creativity costs sanity, but whether we've confused suffering with depth for far too long.